In a revelation no one saw coming, Prince Edward steps forward with a confession that threatens to rewrite decades of royal tradition. Behind palace walls, whispers turn to shock as a long-guarded secret about Prince Philip's military honours surfaces. Was this a carefully structured legacy, or a calculated division that reshaped royal loyalty forever? What Edward reveals is not just history, it's a fracture point within the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The timing, Edward insists, was not accidental. For years he carried the weight of what he had discovered, convincing himself that silence was loyalty and loyalty was survival. But something shifted. Insiders hint at a quiet gathering inside a restricted military archive, an unpublicized review of regimental appointments that forced Edward to confront documents he had never been meant to scrutinize. Dates, signatures, patterns. The realization crept in slowly, then all at once. The distribution of honors among royal family members was not ceremonial routine. It was structured, intentional, and deeply personal. According to those close to him, Edward wrestled with this truth in isolation. His father's military stature was legendary, disciplined, commanding, untouchable. Philip embodied order and hierarchy, a man who believed institutions survived only when ranks were clear and loyalty unquestioned. Yet beneath that towering image, Edward claims, existed decisions that quietly divided his own sons. Certain regiments were elevated to symbols of future authority. Others were granted roles that appeared prestigious but carried little strategic weight. At first glance, it seemed harmless. But when Edward mapped the assignments against succession and influence, a pattern emerged that he could no longer ignore. The tension before his disclosure was palpable. Conversations grew strained. Senior figures within the family allegedly urged restraint, reminding him that legacy is fragile and the public image of unity is sacred. Edward felt that pressure acutely. He was not just revealing administrative choices, he was challenging the mythology surrounding his father's leadership. He knew that once spoken aloud, his words could not be recalled, yet silence felt heavier. In private moments, he questioned whether exposing this truth would dishonor the very man who had shaped him, or finally honor the truth he believed Philip valued above sentiment. When the statement finally surfaced, the reaction was immediate and chilling. There were no dramatic public denials, no fiery speeches. Instead, there was silence, the kind that echoes louder than outrage. Advisors reportedly scrambled behind closed doors, tracing the implications. Calls were placed. Strategies discussed, because Edward's claim suggested something far more unsettling than uneven distribution of medals. It implied hierarchy engineered within the family itself. It suggested that recognition had been wielded not merely as reward, but as reinforcement of status, of expectation, of future power. Edward's voice, though steady, carried strain. He spoke not as a rebel, but as a son grappling with conflicting loyalties. Loyalty to a father he respected, loyalty to a monarchy he serves, and loyalty to his own conscience. He did not accuse Philip of malice. Instead, he framed the division as strategic, perhaps even protective. But strategy has consequences. When honors become signals of importance, those without them feel the absence. And in that absence, resentment can quietly grow. What makes this revelation explosive is not the medals themselves. It is what they represented: validation, favor, preparation. Edward's confession hints that some were groomed through visible military prominence, while others were positioned at the margins of ceremonial influence. Whether deliberate or instinctive, Philip's choices may have reshaped not only regimental affiliations, but emotional bonds within his own family. Now, with the secret exposed, the monarchy stands at an uncomfortable crossroads. Was this the necessary discipline of a wartime mind, safeguarding an institution, or a calculated division that left scars unseen by the public eye? Edward's revelation does not provide easy answers. Instead, it opens a door long kept closed. But to understand the weight of Edward's revelation, we must first revisit the man whose legacy now stands under a new and startling light. Prince Philip was more than a royal consort. He was a decorated naval officer whose military reputation became part of the monarchy's backbone. But beneath the medals and ceremonies, There was a system, a structure, a pattern. And according to Edward, that system was never random. Was Philip honoring merit or orchestrating influence across generations? To understand the storm Edward has unleashed, we must return to the origin of Philip's authority, the sea. Long before palace corridors and constitutional duty defined his life, Philip was forged in the discipline of naval command. War shaped him, hierarchy strengthened him. In battle, clarity meant survival. Rank was not symbolic, it was sacred. That mindset did not fade when he married into the crown. It followed him, quietly embedding itself into the architecture of royal life. Prestige clung to him not because of ceremony, but because of service. And that service granted him an authority that few dared to challenge. As decades passed, Philip's influence extended beyond personal honor into institutional design. He became more than a symbol of military pride. He became a gatekeeper of regimental patronage within the royal family. Honorary colonelcies, naval affiliations, ceremonial leadership roles, these were not mere decorations. They were statements. Each appointment signaled importance, visibility and trust. Within royal tradition, military patronages are powerful currency. They bind the monarchy to the armed forces, they project strength, they shape public perception, and, as Edward now suggests, they quietly shape internal hierarchy as well. Philip understood this power intimately. He believed in structure, in discipline, in preparing the monarchy for endurance rather than applause. According to Edward, his father approached military appointments the way a commander allocates strategic positions. Certain family members were placed in highly visible regiments with deep historical resonance. Others were given roles that, while honorable, carried less symbolic weight. On the surface, the distribution seemed balanced. But over time, patterns began to emerge, patterns that Edward claims were deliberate. Subtle rivalries took root. Regimental affiliations became more than ceremonial attire. They became reflections of perceived standing. When one royal was frequently seen at prestigious military events, while another was absent from key appearances, questions surfaced quietly, privately. No one spoke openly of favoritism. That word was too dangerous. Instead, there were raised brows, prolonged silences, and private reflections. The monarchy's public unity masked a complex emotional undercurrent. Edward recalls fragments of childhood that now feel sharper in hindsight, conversations cut short when he entered the room. The way certain appointments were discussed with pride, while others were mentioned in passing. He remembers sensing a hierarchy long before he understood it. At the time, he accepted it as the natural order of royal life. But as he matured and mined the record more closely, acceptance gave way to doubt. Doubt became suspicion, and suspicion hardened into conviction. Philip never publicly explained his rationale. He did not need to. His authority was rarely questioned. Yet Edward suggests that behind his father's stoic exterior lay a strategic mind mapping out the monarchy's future. Military honors were not simply acknowledgements of service, they were endorsements of significance. They positioned some royals closer to the symbolic heart of national defense, while others remained peripheral. Whether this was preparation for succession, reinforcement of tradition, or a reflection of personal preference remains the question that now lingers heavily. The grandeur of Philip's military image remains undeniable. His dedication was real, his belief in duty unwavering, but Edward's revelation casts that image in a new light, one tinged with unease. If honors were distributed with intention beyond ceremony, then every salute carried subtext, every appointment whispered meaning, and it is within those subtle imbalances that Edward claims the true story begins to unfold. For years, the distribution of military honors seemed ceremonial routine, even predictable. But Edward alleges there was a dividing line. Certain royals were strategically elevated, while others were left in symbolic shadows. Was it favoritism, preparation for succession, or something more personal between father and sons? At first glance, everything appeared balanced. Each sibling received a title, a uniform, a regiment to represent. Publicly, it was presented as harmony, a proud family bound together in service. But when Edward began comparing the details, the symmetry dissolved. Some appointments carried historic prestige, linking their holders to regiments steeped in national memory and visible influence. Others, though respectable, lacked the same symbolic gravity. The distinction was subtle, almost invisible to the public eye. Yet inside the family, it was impossible to ignore. Edward describes studying the timeline of these appointments with growing unease. Certain brothers were positioned at the forefront of military ceremony, appearing consistently at high-profile events, forging visible bonds with elite units. Their uniforms told a story of prominence. Meanwhile, others found themselves attached to regiments that rarely commanded headlines or ceremonial focus. On paper, the distribution looked fair. In practice, it created tears. And tears, Edward now suggests, were never accidental in his father's world. Philip, he claims, believed fiercely in strength through hierarchy. It was a philosophy born from war and discipline. In battle, clarity of command meant survival. In monarchy, he may have believed, clarity of status ensured stability. If that was his reasoning, it was never openly discussed. Instead, it was embedded quietly within decisions that shaped how each son was perceived, not just by the public, but by the institution itself. The emotional strain simmered beneath formal smiles. Brothers who shared childhood memories now found themselves measured against ceremonial visibility. Recognition became currency. Validation became unspoken competition. Edward recalls moments when the weight of comparison hung heavy, though no one dared articulate it outright. The monarchy does not encourage open confrontation. It encourages endurance. But endurance has a cost. More troubling, Edward hints that certain honors were not merely assigned, they were withheld. He suggests there were discussions that ended with silence, proposals that quietly dissolved, opportunities redirected. Whether this was strategic caution or deliberate exclusion remains uncertain. What is certain is the psychological toll. For younger royals, seeking affirmation, regimental recognition was more than decoration. It was acknowledgement from a father who valued service above sentiment. To receive a prestigious appointment meant approval. To receive a lesser one, or none at all, felt like quiet dismissal. Edward's internal struggle deepened as he began to interpret these patterns not as coincidence, but as design. He did not want to believe his father capable of division. He admired Philip's discipline, respected his resilience. Yet the evidence unsettled him. Each new detail reinforced the idea that hierarchy had been carefully constructed within the family, reinforcing future roles long before they were formally declared. It was preparation disguised as ceremony, strategy wrapped in tradition. The realization did not come with anger. It came with heartbreak. Edward wrestled with the possibility that what he once perceived as random allocation was in fact a calculated shaping of destiny. And if that were true, then every salute, every uniformed appearance, carried emotional weight far beyond public understanding. It meant that success, for some, may have required silent sacrifice from others. As these doubts crystallized into conviction, Edward faced an impossible choice: protect the image of unity or confront the system he believed had quietly divided them. And the more he examined the past, the clearer it became that this was never just sibling rivalry. Yet Edward's claims go deeper than rivalry. He suggests intention behind every decision. What if the division of military honors was never about prestige, but about shaping the future monarchy? Edward implies Philip was quietly reinforcing the line of succession through regimental symbolism. Medals, uniforms, titles, they were messages, signals, preparations for a future battle not on the field, but within the palace walls. As Edward revisited years of appointments and ceremonial alignments, a new possibility emerged, one that reframed everything. Military patronage within the royal family is not decorative. It binds the crown to the armed forces, reinforces authority, and projects stability. When a royal stands at the helm of a historic regiment, it sends a message of continuity, of command, of destiny. And if those positions were assigned with foresight, then Philip was not merely honoring service, he was mapping the monarchy's future in plain sight. Certain heirs, Edward notes, were placed in highly visible regimental roles early and consistently. They became synonymous with elite branches, their names woven into the narrative of national defense. Public appearances reinforced the association. Speeches strengthened the bond. Over time, these roles shaped perception. The public began to see specific figures as natural embodiments of leadership within the armed forces. That perception, Edward suggests, was not accidental. It was cultivated. The symbolism behind ceremonial appointments carries weight that outsiders rarely recognize. A coloncy here, a naval title there. Each one attaches history to an individual. When Philip approved or influenced these decisions, he was not simply distributing honor, he was signaling alignment with the future line of succession. In the language of monarchy, symbolism speaks louder than declarations. By elevating certain royals into regiments steeped in tradition and prestige, he may have been strengthening their authority long before they formally ascended. Edward also alludes to Philip's quiet influence within military advisory circles. Though never overtly political, Philip's counsel carried gravitas. His wartime experience gave him credibility, and credibility gave him leverage. He understood the armed forces not as spectacle, but as institution. That understanding positioned him uniquely to shape which royal figures would stand closest to its core. If succession required public trust, then military alignment was a powerful foundation. But where some were elevated, others were subtly sidelined. Not through humiliation, not through scandal, through absence, through quieter appointments that lacked national resonance. Edward believes those choices communicated hierarchy without confrontation. They defined proximity to power without ever speaking the word succession aloud. In Philip's world, clarity did not require explanation, it required structure. Yet this strategic shaping clashed with a changing era. The monarchy was under pressure to modernize, to soften, to connect emotionally with a public that valued relatability over rigid hierarchy. Tradition demanded discipline, modernity demanded transparency. Philip's approach, forged in wartime certainty, may have felt increasingly at odds with a new generation seeking balance between duty and individuality. Edward found himself caught in that tension, respecting the discipline of the past while sensing its emotional cost. As he pieced together these elements, Edward realized that legacy building is never neutral. Every decision plants a seed. Some grow into authority, others grow into resentment. Philip may have believed he was safeguarding stability, reinforcing the crown through strategic symbolism. But strategy, no matter how well-intentioned, leaves impressions. And those impressions linger long after ceremonies conclude. Edward's revelation reframes the monarchy not as passive recipient of tradition, but as active architect of its own hierarchy. If medals were messages, then their distribution told a story of preparation and positioning of a father shaping destiny through discipline. But in shaping the institution, he may have reshaped his family as well. But strategy often comes at a cost, and Edward Sugar's the emotional toll was far greater than anyone realized. If Edward's account is true, the real drama didn't unfold at ceremonies. It erupted behind closed doors, heated conversations, silent dinners, subtle stares across polished tables. Philip's decisions allegedly ignited confrontations that were never meant to leave palace walls. Behind the grandeur of regimental salutes and formal speeches, another narrative was unfolding, one far more fragile and far more human. Edward suggests the discussions about military appointments did not always end in agreement. They ended in restraint, in tightened jaws, in words chosen carefully to avoid open rebellion. Philip, unwavering and resolute, believed structure must never bend to emotion. His sons, bound by respect and expectation, often swallowed their doubts. But silence does not erase tension, it buries it. There were moments, Edward recalls, when private disagreements edged dangerously close to rupture. Questions were raised not in defiance, but in confusion. Why this regiment? Why that exclusion? Why did certain honors carry such visible prominence while others felt symbolic at best? Philip's answers, if given, were firm. The monarchy required clarity. The line of authority must never appear uncertain. In his mind, discipline was love expressed through preparation, but to those standing outside that inner logic, it felt like distance. Some royals, Edward implies, carried quiet disappointment that never reached the public ear. To feel diminished in a family where every gesture is scrutinized by a nation is a heavy burden. Recognition within the monarchy is not merely professional, it is personal. When acknowledgement appears uneven, insecurity follows. And insecurity, when unspoken, deepens into quiet resentment. No one stormed out of rooms. No one issued ultimatums. Instead, emotions settled like dust unseen but suffocate. Ng. Edward's breaking point came during a conversation he never expected to define him. It was not explosive. It was measured, restrained, painfully civil. He questioned the pattern he believed he saw. Philip listened, then responded with the same conviction that had guided his entire life. Hierarchy ensures survival. The institution must come before individual feeling. In that moment, Edward understood that his father would not concede, not because he did not care, but because he believed caring required toughness. Discipline over diplomacy, stability over sentiment. Amid this quiet turbulence, the Queen remained composed. Edward describes her presence not as intervention, but as balance. She understood the emotional undercurrents yet upheld unity above all else. Her silence was not indifference, it was preservation. She knew the monarchy's strength lay in its image of cohesion. Personal grievances could not fracture that facade, so tensions remained contained. Conversations concluded without resolution, and life continued as if nothing had shifted. The fear of public perception loomed constantly. Any hint of division would be magnified beyond control. Advisors reinforced the same message. Whatever disagreements existed must remain private. The monarchy had endured wars and crises. It could not afford whispers of internal rivalry over honours, and so the family carried its unease in silence, presenting solidarity to a world that never suspected complexity beneath the surface. But Edward's awareness deepened. He began to sense that history, left unchallenged, would remember only the pageantry. It would praise Philip's discipline without acknowledging its cost. It would celebrate regimental alignment without understanding the emotional calculus behind it. That thought unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. He did not want his father reduced to accusation, but either did he want truth erased. The contrast between public success and private strain became impossible to ignore. Ceremonies projected strength, conversations revealed fracture. And as years passed, Edward's conviction solidified. What happened behind those closed doors mattered as much as what happened on parade grounds, and as tensions simmered privately, the public facade remained flawlessly intact until now. On parade grounds and balcony appearances, the royal family projected unity, crisp uniforms, synchronized salutes, unwavering composure. But Edward now suggests that beneath that perfect choreography, there were fractures no one could see. The medals glittered, but so did resentment. Year after year, the spectacle unfolded with mathematical precision. Trooping the colour became more than celebration. It became reassurance. The monarchy stood aligned before the nation, a living portrait of continuity. Each uniform carried history stitched into its fabric. Each salute reinforced loyalty not only to regiment, but to crown. Cameras captured symmetry, commentators praised cohesion. The narrative was effortless. A disciplined family bound by service and tradition. Yet Edward confesses that during those moments of public grandeur, he often felt an undercurrent that no broadcast could reveal. While crowds cheered and headlines celebrated harmony, he was acutely aware of invisible hierarchies embedded in the arrangement. Who stood where? Who represented which regiment? Who received the longest applause? These details may have seemed trivial to observers, but within the family, they carried weight. Placement was never random. Association was never random. The media amplified the illusion. Articles highlighted shared smiles, coordinated appearances, and a united front of military pride. Analysts spoke of stability, of a dynasty strengthened by disciplined presentation. The monarchy depended on that perception. It was armor. In times of uncertainty, visible unity reassured the public that the institution remained steady. But Edward now suggests that maintaining that image required emotional restraint bordering on suppression. He describes the psychological burden of playing a role, scripted long before he understood its meaning. Standing in uniform beside his brothers, he projected confidence, loyalty, solidarity. Internally, he wrestled with questions he dared not voice. Was the distribution of regimental prominence shaping public expectations about worth, Was he complicit in reinforcing a hierarchy he privately questioned? Applause echoed around him, yet doubt lingered quietly within. Regimental loyalty, so revered and sacred, became both bond and barrier. It tied each royal to a proud history, yet it also defined their symbolic standing within the family. The very institutions meant to unify them masked divisions beneath the surface. Discipline required composure. Composure required silence. And silence allowed tension to mature, undisturbed. Edward understood that survival of the monarchy depended on that silence. Cracks, once visible, could widen rapidly under scrutiny. There were moments when the contrast felt unbearable. Public triumph paired with private uncertainty. Success intertwined with subtle suffering. He watched narratives form around certain figures' stories of leadership, inevitability, centrality, while others faded quietly into ceremonial background. No accusations were spoken, no confrontations erupted, but the disparity lingered like a quiet echo beneath the music of pageantry. Over time, Edward realized that the illusion of unity was not accidental. It was curated, carefully maintained, necessary, but illusions demand sacrifice. The greater the spectacle, the heavier the silence required to sustain it. And he begged, and to question whether preserving image at all costs was worth the emotional distance it created. The turning point did not arrive in a dramatic confrontation. It arrived in stillness. In the recognition that history would record the parades, the salutes, the flawless appearances, while erasing the doubts behind them. Edward understood then that silence was no longer protection, it was distortion. If the story remained untold, the fractures would remain buried beneath polished ceremony forever. That decision would ignite consequences far beyond what Edward anticipated. When Edward's claims surfaced, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Advisors scrambled, statements were drafted, loyalties were tested. What began as a revelation about military honors quickly became a reckoning about legacy, authority, and truth. Inside palace walls, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Senior royals who had long relied on disciplined silence were suddenly forced into urgent deliberation. Edward's words did not merely question ceremonial decisions, they challenged the architecture of influence carefully constructed over decades. Private aides reportedly moved swiftly, calculating risks, anticipating headlines, assessing how far the tremor might spread. The monarchy has weathered crises before, but this felt different. This was not scandal from the outside. It was introspection from within. Emergency discussions unfolded behind closed doors. How should they respond? Denial would escalate curiosity. Confirmation would validate division. Silence might preserve dignity but also imply unease. The institution thrives on continuity, on measured composure. Yet beneath that composure, anxiety simmered. Philip's reputation stood as a pillar of modern royal strength. To suggest that his strategic decisions carried unintended consequences was to reopen conversations many believed settled forever. Publicly, there was restraint. No dramatic rebuttals, no fiery defenses. The facade held firm, projecting steadiness, but internally, the tension was undeniable. Advisors weighed whether addressing the claims would legitimize them further. Some argued that confronting the narrative head-on would protect Philip's legacy. Others feared that revisiting past decisions would expose deeper complexities. The balance between transparency and preservation grew increasingly fragile. Not everyone viewed Edward's disclosure as betrayal. Quietly, some within the broader royal circle acknowledged the courage it required. They understood that questioning hierarchy is never comfortable, especially in an institution built upon it. These supporters did not issue statements or offer public endorsement. Their backing was subtle, measured, cautious, yet it reinforced Edward's resolve. He was not alone in recognizing that legacy and truth can coexist, even when uneasy. Critics, however, were far less sympathetic. They accused him of destabilizing tradition, of reopening wounds that history had sealed. In their eyes, hierarchy is not cruelty, it is structure. Philip's discipline, they argued, ensured survival through turbulent decades. To dissect those choices now risked undermining the very stability he sought to protect. The word division echoed uncomfortably in private conversations, some worried that Edward's narrative would overshadow a lifetime of service with speculation. The monarchy's greatest fear was not exposure, it was reinterpretation. If the public began to see past regimental appointments as strategic favoritism rather than ceremonial duty, it could reshape perceptions of authority itself. The institution depends on belief in fairness, belief in continuity, belief that tradition is rooted in principle rather than preference. Edward's claims threatened to blur those pressure mounted quietly around him. Suggestions were made softly that perhaps clarification would be wise, that perhaps context had been misunderstood, that perhaps restraint would serve everyone better. Yet Edward did not retreat. His voice remained steady, not defiant, but unwavering. He insisted his intention was not to diminish his father's memory, but to deepen understanding of the complexity behind it. Discipline and love are not opposites, he implied. But neither are they immune from scrutiny. As debates intensified within the palace, one truth became clear. This was no longer about regimental titles. It was about how history is written and who gets to shape its narrative. Edward's stand forced the monarchy to confront a question it had long avoided. Can strength survive transparency, or does silence offer safer ground? Yet the most profound impact of Edward's revelation may not be on the past, but on the future. If Philip's military honours were part of a calculated design, what does that mean for the monarchy moving forward? Edward's exposure forces a new generation to confront an uncomfortable question. Should legacy be preserved at all costs, or examined with courage? The ripple effect of Edward's revelation does not end with retrospection. It presses forward into corridors where younger royals now stand, aware that the symbolism they inherit may carry more meaning than they once believed. For decades, patronages were accepted as tradition, ceremonial extensions of duty, passed down without scrutiny. But now, quiet conversations are emerging about whether tradition alone is enough. If appointments once reinforced hierarchy, should they now reflect transparency and merit more visibly? The definition of merit itself appears to be shifting. In a modern monarchy seeking relevance, public engagement, service impact, and authenticity weigh heavily. The new general, a change, understands that visibility is no longer controlled solely by pageantry. It is shaped by public trust. If military roles are to remain central to royal identity, they may need to align not just with succession, but with demonstrable commitment. Edward's disclosure has sparked introspection. Is honor inherited, or should it be actively earned? There are murmurs of potential restructuring. Nothing dramatic, nothing abrupt, but subtle recalibration. A reassessment of how honorary roles are distributed, how regimental affiliations are explained, how symbolism is communicated, not to dismantle tradition, but to clarify it. To ensure that what appears as hierarchy does not conceal perceived favoritism. The monarchy, at its strongest, adapts quietly. And this may be one of those moments. Beyond palace walls, the public debate has grown increasingly thoughtful. Commentators question whether transparency strengthens institutions rather than weakens them. Some argue that Edward's honesty invites necessary reflection. Others caution that revisiting past decisions risks eroding reverence. Yet, the very fact that such dialogue exists suggests a transformation underway. The monarchy is no longer shielded from introspection. It is shaped by it. For Edward, loyalty has taken on a new meaning. He insists that silence is not always devotion. Sometimes, loyalty requires courage, the courage to illuminate complexity rather than simplify it. In speaking out, he did not aim to diminish his father's service, he sought to humanize it. To acknowledge that even disciplined leadership carries emotional consequences. Whether his family agrees entirely remains uncertain. Closure, like hierarchy, does not arrive neatly packaged. Within the family, reconciliation is delicate. Conversations continue, some guarded, some sincere. There may never be unanimous agreement on Philip's intentions, but here is growing recognition that the story is more layered than once believed. The younger generation observes carefully. They understand that legacy is not static. It evolves through interpretation, and how they respond now may define their own futures. Strangely, this revelation may ultimately fortify the institution. By confronting the possibility of imbalance, the monarchy demonstrates resilience. Institutions that adapt endure. Those that resist examination risk stagnation. Edward's decision, controversial as it is, forces a recalibration that could align tradition with modern expectation. In that tension lies opportunity. The contrast is striking. A legacy built on discipline now facing scrutiny through transparency. A family bound by duty navigating emotional reckoning. Success and strain intertwined, as they so often are within the crown. The future remains unwritten, but it will undoubtedly carry the imprint of this moment. And as the dust settles, one final truth lingers. This was never just about medals. In the end, Prince Edward's revelation isn't merely about military honors, it's about fathers and sons, expectation and validation, legacy and love. Did Philip divide honors to protect the monarchy, or did he unknowingly divide his own family? The answer may reshape how history remembers them both. Strip away the regiments, the titles, the ceremonial grandeur, and what remains is something profoundly human. Philip was a man forged by war, hardened by responsibility, guided by an unshakable belief that structure preserves survival. He loved through discipline, he prepared through hierarchy. To him, clarity was kindness, even when it felt severe. Yet leadership shaped by battlefields does not always translate gently into fatherhood. The very traits that fortified the crown may have complicated the bonds within it. Edward's pain is not theatrical. It is restraint. Ed measured, almost reluctant, in exposing what he believes to be a deliberate pattern. He is not attacking his father's legacy, he is confronting it, and that confrontation carries weight. To question a public hero is one thing, to question your own father is another. Edward understood the risk. He knew his words could be misinterpreted as resentment, but he also knew that silence would seal a narrative incomplete. His struggle was not against Philip, it was against the fear that truth might disappear beneath reverence. The line between discipline and favoritism is razor thin. Philip may have believed he was strengthening the monarchy by reinforcing its future through symbolic authority. He may have viewed regimental prominence as preparation, not preference. Yet perception matters. For those who stood slightly outside the center of that symbolic circle, the message felt personal. When hierarchy becomes visible, emotion follows. And emotion, once stirred, cannot be neatly filed away like a ceremonial document. This is the monarchy's eternal paradox. Tradition demands resilience. Humanity demands empathy. One builds institutions, the other builds relationships. When the two collide, compromise becomes nearly impossible. Philip chose endurance, Edward chooses examination. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but together they create tension that now stands exposed to public view. As this story has unfolded, something unexpected has emerged: empathy, not only for Edward, but for those who may have felt overlooked. The public, long accustomed to polished unity, now glimpses vulnerability. And vulnerability has a strange power. It softens rigid narratives. It invites reflection. It reminds people that beneath crowns and uniforms are individuals shaped by expectation as much as ambition. For Edward, the emotional imprint will not fade quickly. Speaking out does no erase doubt. It amplifies it. He must now live with the knowledge that he altered how his father's decisions are discussed. He must carry both relief and consequence. There is courage in that, but also loneliness. When you challenge a long-standing myth, you stand briefly outside it, and yet there is a deeper question lingering beneath the controversy. Does truth fracture institutions or fortify them? History often reveals that suppressed tension eventually resurfaces. By addressing it openly, Edward may have given the monarchy an opportunity to evolve rather than erode. Institutions that acknowledge complexity tend to endure longer than those that insist on perfection. The contrast between success and suffering remains stark. A father celebrated for discipline, a son burdened by introspection, a dynasty projecting strength while navigating emotional reckoning. This is not a story of villains and heroes. It is a story of intention and impact, of preparation and perception, of love expressed through structure and love seeking understanding. Ultimately, medals tarnish. titles shift, public memory transforms. What endures are the choices made when silence feels safer than honesty. Edward chose honesty. Philip chose discipline. The monarchy must now reconcile both. And perhaps, as history turns its gaze back on the House of Windsor, the greatest honor of all will not be found in medals, but in the courage to reveal what was hidden for so long. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.